The ransom video showed 24-year-old Lieutenant David Sullivan beaten and bound in a concrete cell somewhere in Syria. His captors demanded $2 million and the release of their imprisoned leader. The Pentagon said negotiation would take weeks. David's father, retired Colonel Marcus Sullivan, gave himself 72 hours, because some fathers teach their sons to ride bikes, others teach them to never give up, and a few teach them that family always comes first, no matter the cost. Welcome to another incredible story of courage that knows no boundaries. Before we dive into Marcus's impossible mission, tell me in the comments, what would you do for your family, and if you believe that a father's love can move mountains? Hit that subscribe button. These stories of sacrifice and determination need to be told. Colonel Marcus Sullivan had spent 30 years serving his country with distinction. From the jungles of Panama to the mountains of Afghanistan, he had led men through impossible situations and brought them home alive. His military record read like a textbook on special operations: Bronze Star, Silver Star, Purple Heart, and decorations from a dozen allied nations. But all of that meant nothing on the morning of March 15, 2019, when the call came that would change everything. Marcus was in his workshop behind his Virginia home, restoring the 1967 Mustang that he planned to give David when his son returned from deployment. The phone rang at exactly 0847 hours. He always remembered military time, and the voice on the other end belonged to General Patricia Hayes, David's commanding officer. "Marcus, we need to talk. It's about David." The workshop suddenly felt smaller. Marcus set down his wrench and straightened to his full 6'2" frame, his weathered hands steadying against the workbench. In 30 years of military service, he delivered similar calls to other fathers. He knew the tone, knew the careful choice of words that preceded devastating news. "How bad is it, Patricia?" His reconnaissance team was conducting intelligence gathering near the Syrian border. They were compromised. David's team managed to extract, but he stayed behind to ensure their safe withdrawal. "He's been missing for 18 hours. Missing in action." 3 words that every military family dreads, but hopes never to hear. Marcus closed his eyes and saw David as he'd always been. Determined, selfless, always putting others first. Even as a child, David had possessed an almost supernatural sense of responsibility for those around him. "What's the situation on the ground?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the storm building inside him. "Intelligence suggests he was taken by a Syrian militant group operating near Aleppo. We're working through diplomatic channels, but Marcus," General Hayes paused, "you know how these things work. It could take time. Time." Marcus understood what that meant in military speak. Time for bureaucrats to debate. Time for politicians to calculate costs. Time for his son to suffer in a concrete cell while forms were filled out and permissions were sought. "I understand, Patricia. Thank you for calling." But Marcus Sullivan had no intention of waiting for diplomatic solutions. After hanging up, he sat alone in a workshop for exactly 10 minutes. Long enough to process the information and begin formulating a plan. Then he walked into the house where his wife Carol was preparing breakfast, unaware that their world had just been shattered. "Carol, we need to talk." She took one look at his face and knew. 28 years of marriage to a special operations officer had taught her to read the signs. The coffee mug slipped from her hands, shattering on the kitchen floor, but neither of them moved to clean it up. "Is he alive?" she whispered. "As far as we know, yes. He's been captured." Carol Sullivan had been a military wife long enough to understand the implications. She'd attended too many funerals, comforted too many widows, and knew that captured soldiers didn't always come home. But she also knew her husband, and she could see something in his eyes that the Pentagon generals couldn't. The look of a father who had already made his decision. That evening, the ransom video arrived through encrypted channels, monitored by U.S. intelligence. Marcus watched it alone in his study, memorizing every detail that might provide clues about David's location. The video was brief, but devastating. David, clearly beaten but defiant, reading a prepared statement demanding the release of Hazem San, a high-value terrorist leader held in a maximum security facility. The militants gave the U.S. government 72 hours to comply, or they would execute the captured American soldier. The Pentagon's response came the next morning during a secure video conference. General Hayes, flanked by State Department officials and intelligence analysts, laid out the official position. The United States does not negotiate with terrorists. We're exploring military options, but any rescue operation would require extensive planning and carries significant risks. Marcus listened without interruption as they explained the complexities: Syrian airspace restrictions, uncertain intelligence about David's exact location, the diplomatic implications of unauthorized military action. Everything they said was logical, measured, and entirely inadequate. How long for a rescue operation? Marcus asked. Realistically? 2 to 3 weeks minimum. We need to confirm his location, plan extraction routes, coordinate with allied forces. Marcus thanked them for their time and ended the call. 2 to 3 weeks. His son had 48 hours. That night, Marcus made the most difficult call of his life, to Carol, who was staying with her sister to avoid media attention that was already building around David's capture. The Pentagon wants to wait, he told her simply. And you? I'm going to bring him home. Carol was quiet for a long moment. She'd known this conversation was coming since the moment they'd learned of David's capture. Marcus, you've been retired for 5 years. You don't have resources, intelligence networks, or backup. It's suicide. Maybe. But he's our son, Carol. And I taught him never to leave a man behind. I can't ask him to live by a code I'm not willing to follow myself. What happened over the next 12 hours would have impressed even Marcus's former special operations colleagues. Using contacts built over 3 decades of military service, he began assembling resources that technically didn't exist. His first call went to Tommy Rodriguez, a former Delta Force operator, who now ran a private security company in Jordan. Tommy owed Marcus his life from an operation in Iraq 15 years earlier, the kind of debt that never expires in the military community. I need transportation, weapons, and intelligence, Marcus said without preamble. Where and when? Syria. Now. Tommy didn't ask questions. I'll have a package ready for pickup in Amman. How much heat are you planning to bring? Whatever it takes. The second call went to Sarah Chen, a former CIA analyst, who had left the agency after becoming disillusioned with bureaucratic constraints. Sarah now worked as an independent intelligence consultant, operating in the gray areas where official agencies couldn't go. I need satellite imagery, communications intercepts, and anything you can find about Syrian militant groups operating near Aleppo, Marcus told her. Marcus, what you're planning is insane. You're one man against an entire organization. I'm not one man, Sarah. I'm a father. There's a difference. By dawn, Marcus had flight arrangements to Jordan, a weapons cache waiting for pickup, and intelligence packages being compiled by some of the best analysts in the business. He also had something equally important, a plan that leveraged everything he'd learned in 30 years of impossible missions. The key was understanding that this wasn't a military operation. It was a rescue mission with a military execution. The goal wasn't to defeat the enemy force, it was to extract one person and disappear before they could respond. Marcus arrived in Amman, Jordan, 18 hours after watching the ransom video. Tommy Rodriguez met him at a private airfield outside the city, where a nondescript warehouse contained everything Marcus would need for his mission. Intel says your boy is being held at a compound approximately 30 kilometers northeast of Aleppo, Tommy reported, spreading satellite photographs across a metal table. The facility is run by a group calling itself the Syrian Liberation Brigade. About 40 fighters, mostly foreign recruits with some local support. Marcus studied the photographs with the practiced eye of someone who had planned dozens of similar operations. The compound was typical of militant hideouts. Concrete buildings surrounded by high walls, multiple escape routes, defensive positions that could hold off a significant force. Weakness? Marcus asked. Overconfidence. They're not expecting a rescue attempt, especially not from a single operator. Security is focused on keeping your son in, not keeping threats out. The weapons package was comprehensive but carefully selected. Suppressed rifle, sidearm, explosives, communications gear, and most importantly, night vision equipment that would give Marcus a critical advantage in low-light conditions. Transportation? Marcus inquired. Modified pickup truck with civilian markings. It'll get you to the Syrian border, but after that, you're on foot. Tommy handed Marcus a satellite phone with encrypted capabilities. Emergency contact only. If this goes sideways, we never met. Marcus understood. Tommy was risking his business, and potentially his freedom by providing support for an unauthorized mission. But that's how it worked in the military community. When one of their own was in trouble, official channels became secondary to moral obligations. The border crossing into Syria required all of Marcus's experience in clandestine operations, using routes established by smugglers and refugees. He crossed at night through terrain that provided natural concealment from border patrols. Once inside Syria, Marcus became a ghost. Moving through war-torn Syria required skills that Marcus had developed over decades of operating in hostile territory. During the day he remained hidden, using abandoned buildings and natural terrain features to avoid detection. At night he moved steadily toward the target compound, covering ground with the patient determination of a predator stalking prey. The intelligence Sarah Chen had provided proved invaluable. Communications intercepts had revealed the militants' operational patterns, guard schedules, and most importantly, confirmation that David was alive and being held in the compound's central building. But intelligence also revealed something that made Marcus's blood run cold. The militants were planning to move David to a secondary location within 24 hours. If Marcus didn't act soon, his son would disappear into Syria's vast network of underground facilities, making rescue virtually impossible. On his second night in Syria, Marcus reached the observation point overlooking the target compound. What he saw through his scope confirmed both his worst fears and his greatest hopes. David was alive. Marcus could see him during a brief moment when guards moved him between buildings. But his son was clearly injured, moving with the careful gait of someone dealing with significant pain. The compound itself presented both opportunities and challenges. The militants had grown complacent, exactly as Tommy had predicted. Guard rotations were irregular, perimeter security was minimal, and most importantly, they weren't expecting trouble. But 40 fighters, even complacent ones, represented overwhelming odds for a single operator. Marcus would need to rely on surprise, speed, and the kind of precision planning that had made him legendary during his active duty career. What Marcus planned next went against every principle of conventional military tactics. Instead of waiting for optimal conditions, he decided to create them. Using intelligence about the compound's routine, Marcus identified a pattern. Every night at approximately 200 hours, most of the fighters gathered in the main building for evening prayers and planning sessions. During this 30-minute window, only 6 guards remained on active duty. Marcus's plan was audacious in its simplicity. He would simultaneously neutralize the perimeter guards, breach the building where David was held, and extract his son while the majority of enemy forces were distracted. The operation required split-second timing and perfect execution of multiple complex tasks. But Marcus had one advantage that the militants couldn't account for. 30 years of experience in impossible situations had taught him that the most effective operations often appeared to be the most reckless. At 21:30 hours on March 18th, exactly 71 hours after receiving news of David's capture, Marcus began his assault. The first phase went exactly as planned, using suppressed weapons and techniques perfected during decades of night operations. Marcus neutralized the perimeter guards without raising any alarms. The militants' overconfidence worked in his favor. They simply weren't prepared for a professional military assault. The second phase required Marcus to traverse 50 meters of open ground to reach the building where David was being held. This was the most dangerous part of the operation, requiring him to move with absolute silence, while maintaining readiness for immediate combat if discovered. Marcus covered the distance in under 90 seconds, reaching the building's rear entrance, just as the call to evening prayers echoed from the main compound. The timing was perfect, almost too perfect. The building where David was held consisted of 3 rooms connected by a narrow corridor. Intelligence suggested David was in the rear room, guarded by 2 militants, who rotated shifts every 4 hours. Marcus's entry was swift and silent. The first guard never knew what hit him. A combination of suppressed gunfire and hand-to-hand combat techniques that Marcus had perfected in a dozen different theaters of operation. The second guard managed to raise his weapon but never got the chance to use it. When Marcus opened the door to David's cell, the reunion was both heartbreaking and inspiring. David looked up from the concrete floor where he'd been lying, his face bruised and swollen, but his eyes still holding the defiant spark that Marcus remembered from childhood. David's voice was barely a whisper, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "Time to go home, son." But their reunion was interrupted by the sound Marcus had been dreading. Shouts from the main compound as someone discovered the eliminated guards. The militants were beginning to realize they were under attack. David was injured but mobile. A broken rib and significant bruising would slow their movement, but Marcus had planned for this contingency. The extraction route he'd identified avoided the main compound and led directly to terrain that favored a small mobile force over a larger pursuing group. "Can you run?" Marcus asked as he cut David's restraints. "With you? I can do anything." What followed was a fighting withdrawal that showcased everything Marcus had learned about small unit tactics. Using explosives placed during his infiltration, he created diversions that split the pursuing force and channeled them into predetermined kill zones. But the militants had advantages too. Local terrain knowledge, numerical superiority, and communications equipment that allowed them to coordinate their pursuit. What should have been a clean extraction became a running battle across 10 kilometers of hostile territory. Father and son moved through the Syrian landscape like ghosts, using every technique Marcus had learned and every lesson he'd taught David during childhood camping trips that had actually been informal military training. The militants' pursuit was determined but disorganized. Their leader, Ahmed Qasim, was furious that a single American operative had penetrated his supposedly secure compound and extracted their high-value prisoner. He committed his entire force to the pursuit, spreading them across multiple possible escape routes. This decision played directly into Marcus's strategy. Rather than trying to outrun the entire militant force, he picked off pursuing units one by one, using ambush tactics that gradually reduced their numbers while conserving his own ammunition and energy. David, despite his injuries, proved to be an invaluable partner during the escape. His special forces training complemented his father's experience, creating a two-man team that was far more effective than their numbers suggested. The most critical moment came when they reached the extraction point Marcus had predetermined, a ridge overlooking the border area where Tommy Rodriguez was waiting with transportation. But between them and safety stood the main pursuing force, 20 militants with heavy weapons who had correctly anticipated Marcus's route. "There's too many of them," David observed, studying the enemy positions through Marcus's scope. Marcus smiled grimly. "Son, I didn't come this far to leave you behind now." What happened next would be talked about in military circles for years afterward. Using tactics that seemed impossible for a two-man team, Marcus and David conducted a coordinated assault against overwhelming odds. The battle for the extraction point lasted 47 minutes, and demonstrated why Marcus Sullivan had been considered one of the finest tactical officers of his generation. Using the terrain to his advantage, and coordinating with David's supporting fire, Marcus systematically dismantled the militant defensive position. The key was understanding that they didn't need to defeat the entire force. They just needed to create a gap large enough to reach the extraction point. Using explosives and precision rifle fire, Marcus created chaos in the enemy ranks, while David provided covering fire from an elevated position. But the plan nearly fell apart when David took a bullet to the shoulder during the final assault. The injury wasn't life-threatening, but it left Marcus essentially fighting alone against the remaining militants. This was the moment when 30 years of military experience crystallized into pure instinct. Marcus moved through the battlefield like a force of nature, using every weapon, every technique, and every tactical advantage he'd accumulated during his career. The breakthrough came when Marcus identified the militant leader and eliminated him with a single precision shot from 400 meters. Qasim's death broke the enemy's will to fight, and the remaining militants began to withdraw rather than continue the costly engagement. "Move! Move!" Marcus shouted as he helped David toward the extraction point where Tommy Rodriguez was waiting with engines running. The final 50 meters felt like the longest distance Marcus had ever covered. With David wounded and his own ammunition running low, every step was a gamble against time and the possibility of reinforcement arriving. But they made it. At 0347 hours on March 19th, exactly 72 hours after learning of David's capture, Marcus Sullivan and his son crossed into Jordan in the back of Tommy Rodriguez's vehicle. The medical facility in Amman was discreet, well-equipped, and asked no questions about how two Americans had arrived with combat injuries sustained in Syria. David's wounds were treated while Marcus sat in the waiting room, finally allowing himself to process what they had accomplished. When Carol arrived 12 hours later on a military transport arranged by General Hayes, the reunion was everything Marcus had hoped for during the darkest moments of the mission. Carol held David like she was afraid he might disappear again, while Marcus stood back and watched his family come back together. "How?" was all Carol could manage to say when she finally looked at Marcus. "One step at a time," he replied simply. The Pentagon's reaction was complex and predictable. Officially, Marcus had conducted an unauthorized operation in violation of international law and U.S. policy. Unofficially, he had accomplished in 72 hours what they estimated would have taken weeks through diplomatic channels. General Hayes flew to Jordan personally to debrief Marcus and David. Her conversation with Marcus was private, but those who knew her said she seemed more impressed than angry. "You understand that officially this never happened," she told Marcus. "I understand, but David is home, and that's all that matters." In the weeks that followed, the story of Marcus Sullivan's mission began to circulate through military and intelligence circles. Most of the details remained classified, but enough leaked out to create a legend. David recovered fully from his injuries and returned to active duty, though his experience as a prisoner of war had changed him. The bond between father and son, already strong, had been forged into something unbreakable during their escape through Syria. Carol struggled with the knowledge of what Marcus had risked to bring David home. She was grateful beyond words, but also terrified by how close she had come to losing both the men in her life. "Would you do it again?" she asked Marcus one evening, as they sat on their porch, watching David work on the Mustang that had waited for him in the garage. Marcus considered the question carefully. "I hope I never have to find out." The Syrian militant group that had captured David largely disbanded after Qasim's death, and the embarrassment of losing their prisoner to a single American operator. Several surviving members were captured by Syrian government forces, while others disappeared into the broader conflict. 6 months later, Marcus received an unexpected visit from General Hayes. She arrived at his home in an unmarked government vehicle, carrying a briefcase that contained documents Marcus was not supposed to see. "The president wanted you to know," she said, placing a presidential unit citation on Marcus's kitchen table. "This is for extraordinary heroism in action against enemy forces. It can't be made public, but it's real." Marcus stared at the citation for a long moment. In 30 years of military service, he had received many decorations, but none meant as much as this unofficial recognition of the most important mission of his life. "There's something else," General Hayes continued. "The Defense Department has been reviewing cases of captured personnel. Your mission has influenced new policies about rapid response capabilities and family support during hostage situations." Marcus nodded, understanding the implications. David's rescue had demonstrated gaps in official procedures that needed to be addressed. "Will things change?" he asked. "They already have. We're developing protocols for situations where immediate action might be more effective than prolonged negotiation." The story of Marcus Sullivan's mission became a case study in military schools, though his name was removed from official versions. Students learned about the operation as an example of how unconventional approaches could succeed where traditional methods failed. David completed his military service, and eventually became an instructor at the Army's Special Operations School, where he taught courses on escape and evasion. He never directly mentioned his own experience as a prisoner of war, but his insights into captivity situations were considered unusually comprehensive. Marcus returned to his quiet retirement, finishing the restoration of David's Mustang and occasionally consulting for private security companies. He rarely spoke about his mission to Syria, preferring to let others debate the ethics and implications of what he had done. But within the military community, Marcus Sullivan became something of a legend. His story was whispered among special operations personnel as an example of what one determined individual could accomplish when everything was on the line. Years later, when asked about his decision to undertake such a dangerous mission, Marcus's answer was always the same. "I taught my son that we never leave anyone behind. How could I ask him to live by a code I wasn't willing to follow myself?" The mission had cost Marcus nothing he wasn't willing to pay. He had risked his life, violated international law, and operated outside official channels. But David was home, alive and safe. "Some people think what I did was heroic," Marcus would say. "But any father would have done the same thing. I just happened to have the skills to make it work." Carol disagreed with that assessment. Not every father would have had the courage to try, she would tell people who asked about the story. And not every father would have succeeded. The truth lay somewhere between their perspectives. Marcus had indeed done what any loving father would want to do, but he had also accomplished what very few could have achieved: a successful rescue mission against overwhelming odds in one of the world's most dangerous conflict zones. The bond between Marcus and David Sullivan became stronger than ever after their experience in Syria. They had shared something that few fathers and sons ever experience: a life-and-death situation where their love for each other literally meant the difference between survival and tragedy. David often said that he learned more about courage during his father's rescue than in all his years of military training. Courage isn't the absence of fear, he would explain. It's doing what needs to be done despite being terrified of the consequences. Marcus learned something equally important: that retirement from military service doesn't mean retirement from the values that defined his career. When someone he loved was in danger, 30 years of training and experience had come together to guide him through the most important mission of his life. The story of Marcus Sullivan reminds us that heroism isn't always about serving your country or following orders. Sometimes it's about serving your family and following your heart, even when the odds are impossible and the risks are overwhelming. In a world where bureaucracy often seems to triumph over action, Marcus proved that individual determination can still move mountains. His mission succeeded not because he had superior resources or official support, but because he had something more powerful: a father's love translated into action. So I ask you, what would you risk for the people you love? How far would you go to protect your family? Because sometimes the most extraordinary missions aren't conducted by armies or governments. They're undertaken by ordinary people who refuse to accept that their loved ones are beyond saving. If this story of a father's impossible mission moved you, share it with someone who understands that love knows no boundaries. Subscribe to make sure you never miss stories of courage that transcend duty and enter the realm of pure devotion. Remember, in a world full of people who talk about what they would do, Marcus Sullivan actually did it. And that makes all the difference.